There are people who leave rooms without anyone noticing, not because they are invisible, not because they lack presence, but because their leaving is so gentle, so unhurried, that it feels like the natural fading of evening light. One moment they are there, the next they have slipped away, and only later, much later, does anyone realize the room feels emptier, quieter, as if something essential had withdrawn. This is not about shyness. This is not about social anxiety or introversion in the way most people understand it. This is something far more profound, something that lives in the space between what the world demands and what certain souls can no longer give. There are people walking among us who have seen too much, felt too deeply, understood too clearly. And somewhere along the way, without drama, without announcement, they began their quiet withdrawal. Not from life itself, but from the version of life that asks them to pretend, to perform, to participate in games they can no longer believe in. If you have ever felt the strange pull to step back from conversations that feel hollow, from gatherings that drain you, from relationships that ask you to be smaller than you are, then perhaps you already know what I am about to describe. Perhaps you have already begun your own quiet withdrawal, and perhaps until now you thought something was wrong with you. Nothing is wrong with you. What is happening inside you is not a breakdown. It is a breakthrough that the world does not yet have language for. Let me explain. There comes a point in certain lives when the ordinary rules stop making sense. Not in a rebellious way, not in the way of someone who refuses to follow, but in the way of someone who has followed so completely, so faithfully, that they finally reached the end of the path, only to discover it led nowhere they wanted to go. This is the moment when the withdrawal begins. It starts small. You find yourself declining invitations you would have accepted before. Not because you are busy, but because the thought of making small talk, of laughing at jokes that are not funny, of pretending to care about things that feel increasingly meaningless, this thought exhausts you before you even arrive. You start leaving parties early, then you stop going altogether. You let phone calls go to voicemail, you take longer to respond to messages. And when you do respond, your words are fewer, more careful, as if you are rationing something precious that the world keeps trying to take from you. People notice. They ask if you are okay. They wonder if you are depressed. They suggest you need to get out more, socialize more, engage more, and you smile and nod because explaining would take more energy than you have, because the truth, that you are not withdrawing from life but withdrawing into it, would sound like madness to ears trained to hear only the noise of the world. But here is what they do not understand. Here is what almost no one talks about. The quiet withdrawal of awakened souls is not a retreat from reality. It is a return to it. It is the slow, deliberate movement away from everything artificial and toward everything authentic. It is the soul's way of saying, I cannot keep living on the surface. I need depth, I need silence, I need truth. And the world, which runs on surfaces and noise and comfortable lies, does not know what to do with such a soul. So it pathologizes them, labels them, tries to fix them, tries to pull them back into the performance everyone else has agreed to maintain. But the awakened soul knows something the world has forgotten. They know that withdrawal is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the ancient understanding that not everything deserves your energy. That presence is sacred. That attention is the most valuable currency you possess. And that giving it carelessly, endlessly to anyone and anything that demands it, this is not generosity. This is self-destruction dressed as politeness. Think about what the world asks of you every single day. It asks you to be available, responsive, engaged. It asks you to care about things designed to capture your attention without nourishing your soul. It asks you to maintain relationships that take more than they give. It asks you to perform emotions you do not feel. It asks you to pretend that busyness equals importance, that productivity equals worth, that constant connection equals belonging. And for most people this works, or at least it works well enough. They move through their days without questioning the terms of the agreement. They give their attention freely because they have never considered that attention is something that can be depleted, something that must be protected, something that once scattered to the winds takes tremendous effort to gather back. But the awakened soul has learned this lesson, usually the hard way. usually through exhaustion, through burnout, through the slow realization that they have been giving pieces of themselves to a world that consumes without gratitude and demands without end. And so they begin to withdraw. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the quiet recognition that survival requires boundaries the world will never voluntarily respect. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of the withdrawal. People assume it comes from pain, from trauma, from some wound that needs healing, and sometimes this is true. Sometimes the withdrawal begins as a response to hurt. But more often it begins as a response to clarity. The awakened soul withdraws not because they are broken, but because they have finally become whole enough to recognize what wholeness requires. They withdraw not because they fear the world, but because they have finally stopped fearing their own need for solitude. They withdraw not because they have given up on connection, but because they have finally understood what real connection demands, and they refuse to settle for its imitation. There is a profound difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness is the ache of disconnection, the feeling that you are separate from life, excluded from the warmth that others seem to share. Loneliness is painful because it is unwanted isolation. It is being alone when you wish to be together. But solitude is something else entirely. Solitude is chosen, intentional, sacred. Solitude is the soul's way of coming home to itself after too long spent elsewhere. It is the deep breath after holding your breath for years. It is the silence that allows you to finally hear your own voice. The awakened soul craves solitude the way a desert craves rain, not because they hate company, but because they have learned that without regular returns to solitude, they lose themselves. They become scattered, fragmented, spread so thin that nothing remains at the center. And so they withdraw, quietly, gradually, with the understanding that self-preservation is not selfishness, that protecting your inner world is not a crime against the outer one. I want to tell you about a particular kind of exhaustion, not physical exhaustion, though it often manifests that way. Not even mental exhaustion, though the mind certainly feels its weight. This is something deeper, something that lives in the space between the soul and the world it must navigate. It is the exhaustion of constant translation. The awakened soul moves through a world that speaks a different language, not literally, of course. The words are the same, but the meanings are different. The assumptions are different. The entire framework of what matters, what is worth pursuing, what constitutes a good life, all of it operates on principles the awakened soul has quietly stopped believing in. And so they must translate, constantly, endlessly. They must take their deep knowing and compress it into small talk. They must take their vast questions and shrink them to fit acceptable conversations. They must pretend that the things everyone else cares about still carry weight for them. They must smile at ambitions that seem hollow, celebrate achievements that feel meaningless, participate in rituals they no longer understand. This translation is exhausting. Not because it is difficult, the awakened soul has usually become quite skilled at it over time, but because it is endless, because there is no space where the translation is not required, because every interaction asks them to be something other than what they are. And over time this exhaustion accumulates. It builds in the body as tension, in the mind as fog, in the spirit as a quiet desperation that has no name, until one day the soul simply refuses. Not dramatically, not obviously, but completely. This is when the withdrawal begins in earnest, when the soul, having given everything it can give to the world of surfaces, finally turns inward, finally chooses depth over breadth, finally decides that the cost of belonging to a world it does not recognize is higher than the cost of standing apart. People who have not felt this exhaustion cannot understand the withdrawal. They see someone pulling away and assume crisis, assume failure, assume that something needs to be fixed. But what they are actually witnessing is healing. The quiet withdrawal is the soul's way of putting itself back together after years of fragmentation. It is the natural response to a world that asks too much and gives too little. It is not pathology, it is wisdom. It is not running away from life. It is running toward the only life that feels true. There is something I need you to understand about the relationship between seeing and suffering. The awakened soul sees what others miss. This is not a boast, this is a burden. They see the fear beneath the confidence, the loneliness beneath the laughter, the desperation beneath the success. They see how people perform for each other, how relationships become transactions, how love gets confused with need and need gets confused with control. They see the ways we hurt each other without meaning to, the ways we hurt ourselves while believing we are protecting ourselves, the ways entire lives get built on foundations of unexamined assumptions, then collapse when those assumptions finally crumble. They see too much, and they cannot unsee it. This seeing creates a particular kind of isolation. Not physical isolation. The awakened soul can be surrounded by people and still feel utterly alone. But perceptual isolation, the loneliness of witnessing what others refuse to acknowledge, the strange displacement of living in a world that constantly contradicts itself while pretending everything makes sense. At first, the awakened soul tries to share what they see. They point out patterns, ask uncomfortable questions, invite others into deeper conversations. They believe, naively, hopefully, that if they can just communicate clearly enough, others will see too. Others will understand, others will welcome the depth. But this rarely happens. More often, the awakened soul learns that their seeing makes others uncomfortable. Their questions feel like accusations. Their depth feels like pressure. Their clarity feels like judgment, even when no judgment is intended. And so they learn to hide what they see, to pretend they do not notice, to smile through conversations that feel like elaborate performances, to participate in relationships where the most important things can never be spoken. This hiding is its own kind of exhaustion, its own kind of violence against the self, and eventually it becomes unbearable. This is another reason for the withdrawal. Not just the exhaustion of seeing too much, but the exhaustion of pretending not to see. The soul can only sustain this pretense for so long before it starts to crack, before it starts to demand authenticity, even if authenticity means solitude. The awakened soul would rather be alone with the truth than surrounded by people who require lies. I want to speak now about the particular loneliness of being misunderstood. Not the ordinary misunderstanding that happens in any relationship, but the deeper misunderstanding that comes from operating on a different wavelength than almost everyone around you. The awakened soul speaks and people hear words, but the meaning beneath the words, the vastness that the words are trying to point toward, this gets lost in translation. They express something true, and people respond to something else entirely. They share their heart, and people engage only with their mind. They offer depth, and people take only surface. After a while, this consistent misunderstanding starts to feel like a kind of invisibility, like standing in plain sight while never being truly seen, like shouting into a void that echoes back only distortions of what was said. And the response to this invisibility is often more withdrawal, because what is the point of reaching out if every reach meets only misunderstanding? What is the point of trying to connect if connection requires becoming someone you are not? But here is what I want you to consider. Here is the turn in this reflection that might change everything. What if the misunderstanding is not a failure of others? What if it is not evidence that something is wrong with the world or wrong with you? What if the misunderstanding is simply part of the territory, part of what it means to walk a path that few have walked? The awakened soul often carries an unconscious expectation that understanding should be possible, that if they just explain clearly enough, live authentically enough, love deeply enough, eventually the world will meet them where they are. Eventually, connection will come. But what if this expectation is itself a source of suffering? What if real freedom comes not from being understood, but from releasing the need to be understood? What if the deepest peace arrives only when you stop waiting for the world to see you and start simply being what you are? This is not resignation. This is not giving up on connection. This is something far more radical. It is accepting that your path may be walked alone for long stretches. It is making peace with a solitude that is not punishment, but simply the nature of the terrain. It is learning to draw nourishment from sources the world cannot see or touch or take away. The awakened soul who reaches this understanding undergoes a profound transformation. Their withdrawal, which may have begun as escape, becomes something else. It becomes choice. It becomes power. It becomes the foundation for a life that no longer depends on external validation to feel real. Let me describe what happens in the deep withdrawal. What happens when the soul finally stops reaching outward and turns fully inward. At first there is fear. The fear of missing out, the fear of being forgotten, the fear that stepping back means losing everything. The conditioned mind, so trained to equate connection with survival, sounds every alarm it has. It screams that isolation is dangerous, that you are making a terrible mistake, that you need to return to the world immediately before it is too late. But if you can sit with this fear, if you can let it move through you without being controlled by it, something remarkable begins to happen. The noise quiets, the constant chatter of should and must and what will people think. It fades into background static, then disappears altogether. And in the silence that remains, you begin to hear something you may have forgotten existed. Your own voice. Not the voice that responds to demands. Not the voice that performs for acceptance. Not the voice that has been shaped by a lifetime of trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for you, but your actual voice. The one that speaks from the center of your being. The one that knows what you need without having to be told. The one that has been waiting patiently for you to stop running long enough to listen. This voice does not speak in the language of the world. It does not care about productivity or achievement or how you compare to others. It speaks in a different language entirely. A language of feeling and intuition and deep knowing. A language that the busy mind dismisses as impractical, but that the soul recognizes as home. And when you finally hear this voice, when you finally make enough space for it to be heard, you understand something crucial. You understand that the withdrawal was never about leaving life. It was about finding it. Finding the life that exists beneath all the noise and performance and pretense. The life that was always there, waiting, while you exhausted yourself chasing versions of living that were never meant to satisfy. This is the gift hidden inside the withdrawal. The treasure that can only be found by those willing to step away from the world long enough to discover what exists within themselves. But I must also speak honestly about the dangers, because the withdrawal, as necessary as it may be, is not without its shadows. There is a version of withdrawal that heals, and there is a version that harms, and the difference between them is not always obvious, especially from the inside. The healing withdrawal is temporary. It is strategic. It is the soul gathering its strength for a return to engagement. Not the same engagement as before, but engagement nonetheless. The healing withdrawal creates space for integration, for making sense of what has been seen and felt, for building the internal structures necessary to hold consciousness without being crushed by it. But the harmful withdrawal has no endpoint. It becomes a permanent hiding, a refusal to ever risk connection again, a building of walls so high that nothing can get in, including the love and beauty and growth that the soul still needs to flourish. The difference between these two withdrawals is intention. The healing withdrawal is purposeful. It knows what it is stepping back from and what it is stepping toward. The harmful withdrawal is reactive. It is pure escape without destination. It is running from pain without any vision of what might lie on the other side. If you are in withdrawal right now, if you have been pulling back from the world for days or months or years, I invite you to examine your intention honestly. Are you withdrawing in order to heal? Or are you withdrawing in order to hide? Are you creating space for integration? Or are you building a prison and calling it a sanctuary? Are you gathering strength for a different kind of engagement? Or have you given up on engagement entirely? These are not easy questions, and the answers may shift over time. What begins as healing can slowly become hiding if awareness is not maintained. The walls that once protected can start to constrict. The solitude that once nourished can begin to starve. The awakened soul must walk a narrow path. They need enough withdrawal to maintain their sanity, but not so much that they lose their connection to life entirely. They need boundaries strong enough to protect their inner world, but not so rigid that nothing new can ever enter. This balance is not found once and maintained forever. It must be discovered again and again, adjusted moment by moment. The awakened soul learns to feel when withdrawal has become excessive, when solitude has tipped into isolation, when healthy boundaries have hardened into unhealthy barriers. And they learn to respond, to open when opening is needed, to close when closing is necessary, to dance with the world in a rhythm that honors both their need for depth and their need for connection. There is something else I want to name, something that rarely gets spoken about, but that shapes the experience of awakened souls profoundly. It is the grief of seeing clearly. When you perceive what others miss, you see loss. You see how much potential goes unrealized, how much love goes unexpressed, how much beauty passes unnoticed. You see the tragedy of unconscious living, not as judgment, but as genuine sorrow for what could be but is not. This grief has no outlet. It cannot be shared easily because explaining it is exhausting. It cannot be processed through normal channels because the loss is not personal. It is existential. It is not your loss. It is everyone's loss. And so this grief accumulates. It builds in the heart as a heaviness that has no name. It colors perception with a persistent melancholy that others sometimes mistake for depression. But it is not depression. It is love. Love that has no object. Love that cannot find a place to land. Love that sees so clearly what could be and mourns so deeply what is. The withdrawal is partly a response to this grief, because being in the world means being constantly confronted with the gap between potential and reality. And that confrontation, unrelenting, eventually becomes too much to bear. In withdrawal, the grief can be metabolized, slowly, gently, without the constant re-triggering that comes from watching unconsciousness unfold in real time. The soul can digest its sorrow in solitude, can make peace with what cannot be changed, can find eventually a way to carry the grief without being crushed by it. But this metabolization takes time. It cannot be rushed, and the awakened soul often needs far more time than the world is willing to give them. This is why the withdrawal can last so long. This is why it can seem from the outside excessive or concerning, because the grief that needs processing is vast, and the pace of processing cannot be forced. I want to offer now a different perspective on what the withdrawal is preparing you for. You may have been told, by others, by yourself, by the voice of your conditioning, that withdrawal leads nowhere, that stepping back from the world means stepping out of life, that choosing solitude means choosing to miss everything that matters. But what if the opposite is true? What if the withdrawal is preparation? What if it is apprenticeship? What if the time spent in solitude is actually time spent learning skills that can only be learned in silence? Consider what the awakened soul develops through their withdrawal. They develop discernment, the ability to distinguish between what truly nourishes and what merely entertains, between what genuinely matters and what only seems urgent, between connections that are real and connections that are performed. They develop presence, the capacity to be fully where they are without reaching for somewhere else, the ability to inhabit the moment completely rather than constantly escaping into past or future. They develop depth, the resources to go beneath surface and stay there, to explore the territory that most people skim over in their rush to the next thing. They develop patience, the understanding that real things unfold slowly, that rushing growth does not speed it but damages it, that waiting is not waste but investment. They develop compassion, not the compassion that requires agreement or understanding, but the compassion that can hold difference without judgment, that can witness suffering without needing to fix it, that can love what it cannot change. These qualities, discernment, presence, depth, patience, compassion, they cannot be developed in the noise and rush of ordinary life. They require silence, solitude, the willingness to step back far enough that what is usually invisible becomes visible. The withdrawal in this light is not absence from life, but intensive preparation for a different kind of presence in it. The awakened soul is not wasting time in their solitude. They are developing capacities that will transform how they engage with everything and everyone. And when they finally do return, when they finally step back into the world from which they withdrew, they bring something with them that was not there before. A groundedness, a steadiness, a quality of being that changes every room they enter, every conversation they join, every relationship they touch. The withdrawal is not the end of the story. It is the middle, the necessary middle that makes possible an end that could not be reached any other way. Let me speak about return, because the withdrawal, as necessary as it is, was never meant to last forever. The awakened soul withdraws not to escape the world permanently, but to become capable of meeting it differently. The return looks nothing like what was left behind. It is not a return to old patterns, old relationships, old ways of being. It is not a surrender of what was learned in solitude. It is something entirely new, a way of being in the world that combines presence with protection, connection with boundaries, engagement with discernment. The awakened soul who has completed their withdrawal, or rather, who has reached a stage of it that allows for re-engagement, relates to the world from a different place. They are still fully present, perhaps more present than they have ever been, but they are no longer scattered, no longer fragmented across every demand and expectation. They have learned to remain gathered, even in the midst of activity, to stay centered even when the world tries to pull them off balance. They no longer need everyone to understand them. They have found understanding within themselves. They no longer need connection to feel real. They have discovered that reality is their birthright, independent of validation. They no longer fear the world's noise because they have found a silence inside that nothing external can disturb. And from this place, this grounded, centered, quiet place, they begin to offer something to the world that they could not offer before. Not the frantic giving of someone trying to earn their worth, not the desperate helping of someone who needs to be needed, but the natural outflow of someone who has found their own source, who gives because giving is what fullness does, who helps because helping is what awakened presence naturally accomplishes. This giving is different. It does not deplete. It does not create resentment. It does not come with strings or expectations. It flows freely because it comes from overflow rather than scarcity, because the soul has finally learned that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and has finally taken the time to fill the cup. The world desperately needs what awakened souls have to offer: the depth, the seeing, the truth-telling, the capacity to sit with discomfort without rushing to fix it, the willingness to ask questions that others avoid, the courage to live differently in a world that demands conformity. But the world can only receive these gifts from souls who have done the deep work, who have withdrawn long enough to become whole, who have healed their fragmentation and discovered their center. The world cannot receive from broken givers. It only creates more broken givers. And so the withdrawal, far from being selfish, is actually essential service. It is the preparation without which service becomes self-destruction. It is the filling without which emptying becomes violence against the self. If you are in withdrawal now, know this: what you are doing serves more than yourself. By healing, you prepare yourself to heal others. By withdrawing, you prepare yourself for a return that will transform everything it touches. The quiet withdrawal of awakened souls is not abdication. It is apprenticeship. It is not giving up on the world. It is preparing to meet the world as it actually is, rather than as we wish it to be. It is not failure of connection. It is the beginning of real connection, the kind that can only happen between souls who have first connected with themselves. I want to close with an image. Picture a lighthouse, standing alone on the shore, separate from the mainland, surrounded by dark water. From a distance it might look isolated, lonely, cut off from everything that matters. But watch what happens when darkness falls. The lighthouse begins to shine. And that light that could only be developed in solitude, that could only be maintained through withdrawal from the noise and busyness of the world, that light becomes guidance for every ship navigating dangerous waters. The lighthouse does not need to go to the ships. It does not need to join the traffic on the sea. Its service is different. It stands apart precisely so it can shine. It remains still precisely so it can be found. It accepts its solitude precisely because that solitude makes its gift possible. You may be a lighthouse. Your withdrawal may be the necessary condition for the light you are meant to shine. Your solitude may be the only space where your particular gift can develop. And the world needs your light, not despite your withdrawal but because of it, not in spite of your differentness but because of your differentness. Stand your ground, stay in your solitude as long as you need. Do the deep work that only you can do, and trust that when the time comes, when your light is ready, the ships will find you. They always do. In the meantime, be gentle with yourself. Be patient with the process. Be compassionate toward the part of you that sometimes doubts, sometimes fears, sometimes wishes you could be more like everyone else. You are not like everyone else, and that is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a gift to be developed, a light to be polished, a depth to be honored. The quiet withdrawal of awakened souls is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of everything that matters. May you find peace in your solitude. May you find strength in your stillness. May you find in the depths of your withdrawal the very thing you have been seeking all along, yourself, waiting patiently, ready to be known.